theme, which is social and environmental implications of COVID in terms of the future planning efforts in the region. And I'll ask our first group to kick things off, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Noren, and I'm a second-year master's student in urban planning at the University of Waterloo. On behalf of my team, I will be presenting our work on supporting community well-being by reconsidering the role of public space in current and future pandemics. This work was completed by myself, Dr. Jennifer Dean, Dr. Troy Glover, as well as Mandy Tang. Next slide, please. So public space has long been a focus topic in regard to community health and well-being. Historically, the rural countryside was viewed as an idyllic green space of healing, a space to really cure the ills of the polluted and congested city. Since antiquity, public squares have been used as sites of protest and democratic engagement. And in the mid-20th century, Jane Jacobs led calls to reclaim these urban streets and sidewalks to create vibrant and safe public spaces for pedestrians. More recently, we have focused on the role of parks and green spaces to support both individual and planetary health, as well as the importance of libraries and other social infrastructure to alleviate social isolation and build that strong sense of community. The public realm is often at times this taken for granted aspect of our communities. That is, until it is no longer available. The impact of public space closures during the pandemic has received significant attention by planners, urban thinkers, the media, as well as advocacy groups. There has been no shortage of commentary about how COVID-19 has highlighted these gaps in the provision to the safe spaces for social and physical distancing. This has only been magnified by recent global protests, as COVID-19 is a real-time example of how crucial safe and inclusive public spaces are for our most disadvantaged and vulnerable populations. So our report will be synthesizing the state of thinking on public space and community well-being in the current pandemic and highlights strategies to enhance public space for future health and well-being. Next slide, please. For this work, we have defined public space in accordance to the domains identified by the Project for Public Spaces. So parks, downtown districts, streets and sidewalks, public markets, rural communities, civic buildings, and public squares. We have omitted waterfronts as they are not relevant to the Waterloo region. The concept of community well-being has multiple definitions as well. So because this work is for the region, we opted to use the Canadian Index of Well-being and its 8 identified domains. So healthy populations, time use, democratic engagement, environment, education, community vitality, living standards, and leisure and culture. To guide our thinking on public space and well-being, we've created this framework to identify how specific public spaces either directly or indirectly impact public space. For example, public squares affect community well-being through 4 key domains, as you can see on the visual here. We've overlaid this definition of public space with the well-being domains in order to highlight the range of connections between place and health. Prior to COVID-19, we knew that public spaces were an important asset for communities. Just how important they were for residents in general and vulnerable populations in particular was really brought to the forefront when the pandemic caused the closure of parks, playgrounds, civic buildings, public markets, and other public spaces, which remained virtually empty. Next slide. Our review of existing literature, recent policy changes, and pandemic-specific commentary resulted in 5 major concerns related to public space during COVID-19. These are accessibility and availability, adequacy, equity, economic recovery, and thus the permanence of these prospective solutions, which you will see in the coming slides. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to begin with availability and accessibility. So the pandemic illuminated this stark reality in many places of the imbalance between density and green space. This has led to the overcrowding of certain public spaces, making this physical distancing very difficult. Many cities were quite quick to adapt to this new overcrowding issue, as New York City, for example, began painting circles in parks to maintain that 6-foot measure. Toronto also adapted this strategy. Additionally, the city of Vancouver eliminated parking in parks to allow for that added room for people. But in many communities, there simply isn't enough public space for the population to safely use in this pandemic. Accordingly, communities have been reallocating space to be used by the public. And we want it's like we want people to be physically distant, but social distance can create a myriad of issues to the individual health as well, including social isolation. So it is imperative that these public spaces are open and function safely for exactly that reason. So cities really need to facilitate this balance in order for these spaces to be conducive to community well-being. And if this is not done, these spaces can actually work in reverse, putting the community at risk for disease transmission, specifically in this case. Moving to adequacy, many of our current streets right now cannot support physical distancing measures. Long lines and the increased use of active transportation during the pandemic has shown that cities really need to rethink the design and function of our streets as a measure of both physical activity, but also breathing room with that necessary physical distance. A common response of many cities was to increase the amount of cycling lanes that they have within their city, as well as closing some lanes and even streets to cars. This was prevalent in Waterloo region. Yes, Toronto and Montreal also did this. So travelers can safely exist in the same space while maintaining that important distance. Across the border, Oakland has also implemented thousands of kilometers of quiet streets with this goal in mind. Next slide. Something that's always been an issue within cities is ensuring the fair, equitable access to public goods. So this issue has really been magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has brought to the surface just how many inequities are actually faced by vulnerable populations in terms of accessing necessary public space, as well as the ability to travel safely through these spaces. The city of Vancouver has introduced Van Play, which began as a master plan for parks and recreation that includes equity mapping, which will pinpoint vulnerable areas of the city where more space is needed. On this thought, a lot of the time cities focus on the equality aspect of public space planning and expect equitable outcomes in return. But the truth is that in some communities, some actually need more public space than others to reap the same benefits. Along with this strategy is adjusting community engagement overall to be more community and population specific. Improving the impacts of public space access for new immigrants, for example, would require attention to the diversity of ways in which newcomers use park spaces, the time of day that they engage with these spaces, in addition to utilizing design strategies that would increase physical distancing within these spaces without being defensive and making these spaces in vulnerable areas more welcoming. So now moving to economic recovery. Space continues to be a concern as businesses struggle to open in a way that allows for these new measures. A local solution in Hamilton is outdoor dining districts, which was a motion that was passed in May, which allows for restaurants to utilize the street and parking spaces for patios. And this has been widely adopted elsewhere. Going a step further is the new open air market in Waterloo region, which is located on Willis Way. Retrofitting existing underutilized space and converting it to public use could also be a recovery strategy. This could include community gardens, parks, and just spaces to sit and read a book. Quality public space is necessary social infrastructure for a thriving city, making it a quintessential economic development strategy in this regard. So finally, the permanent aspect of many of these initiatives is obviously coming into question as summer comes down. There have been many new and exciting initiatives coming forward, including the widening of sidewalks for pedestrians, 15-minute cities as we have seen, which would ideally be made permanent. The pandemic has provided opportunities to temporarily try new public space policies, such as the cycling lanes additions throughout the region. Next slide, please. So much of the focus and decision-making during the pandemic was on flattening the curve and curbing the rates of COVID-19. Yet there are many aspects of community health and well-being that were impacted by the closure of public spaces in response to the threat. This is a quintessential wicked problem that I have no doubt future students will be studying. Our review highlights that public spaces, especially parks, streets, sidewalks, civic buildings, and downtown districts were especially hit hard by the physical distancing during the pandemic. These are important spaces for social interaction, mental well-being, and physical activity, as well as economic vitality in Waterloo and elsewhere. In communities such as ours, ensuring that current and future population density and intensification are well balanced with accessible and adequate public spaces will be fundamental. It's promising to see temporary road allocations to support physical distancing for the increase of active transport users, as well as the closure of roads for outdoor dining and the reopening of parks and playgrounds. An immediate task, though, for Canadian communities will be to determine how to sustain these practices into the winter. From an equity perspective, the importance of public space to health and well-being of vulnerable communities has been especially salient during the pandemic. As other presenters have noted earlier today, density limits the availability of private yard space for residents to use while social distancing, making green space in parks much more important. For those community members who are living alone, social isolation has posed significant health challenges without access to vibrant community spaces to encounter others. These issues will remain in future waves of COVID-19 and in future pandemics. Safe strategies for physical distancing in public spaces is a top priority to mitigate some of the social challenges experienced by vulnerable populations during COVID-19 and beyond. In closing, public space has long been an important aspect of community health and well-being, and certainly has remained prominent during the pandemic. While the state of emergency used to enforce public health measures was necessary to slow the spread, such measures have both produced and highlighted other negative impacts on community well-being. The challenge during the recovery phase and during future pandemics will be to use public space to balance these impacts equitably. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. We'll now move on to the next presentation in this theme area, and that's going to deal with food systems, something that's definitely been impacted significantly. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to that group.
Thank you so much, Clarence. So hi, everybody. My name is Marta Wienhoff, and I'm a PhD student in the School of Planning and the Faculty of Environment. Dr. Leah Minaker, who is an assistant professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo, is also an author on this paper. So I will be presenting an overview of our paper on fostering resilient food systems in the region of Waterloo. So in the next slide, I'll start by providing the context for the paper and define exactly what food systems are. I'll go into discussing health, environment, and economy impacts of food systems and how large-scale food supply disruptions, such as COVID-19, impact global and local food supply chains. Lastly, I'll present a set of recommendations for the region that could help support the infrastructure for fostering a local, resilient, and sustainable food system. In the next slide, so global food systems have significant impacts on community health, the economy, and the environment, and are vulnerable to crises such as the recent COVID-19 pandemic. This has sparked communities to think about how they can create sustainable and resilient food systems locally to help withstand any future food supply disruptions. In 2004, the Region of Waterloo Public Health Department initiated the Farms That Sell Local Viability Plan to help identify supports and barriers for farmers selling foods within the region of Waterloo in order to increase local food production, processing, and consumption. Additionally, the region set forth the 2013 Food Systems Charter, which also aims to promote a healthy, just, and sustainable food system. As such, the region of Waterloo has been a national leader in demonstrating their commitment to supporting resilient and sustainable local food systems. So in the next slide, food systems are a series of processes that form the foundation of the food cycle. So they include everything from food production to processing to distribution, consumption, and waste. A sustainable and resilient food system is one that can provide affordable, accessible, and sufficient food to everyone, despite any sudden disruptions, and while focusing on strategic food systems, planning policies at multiple geographical scales. As such, the foundation of a resilient food system is enough arable land on which to produce food for the community. So in this paper, we looked at food systems on global, national, and local scales in regard to what is currently being done to ensure that there is enough food to feed the projected population of 9.8 billion people in 2050, and looking at the paralleled growth in the region of Waterloo and what is being done here alongside planning policy goals and initiatives. With the majority of people expected to be living in urban areas, there are a number of implications for food security as it relates to urbanization. So in the next slide, I'll outline three major areas of food system influence. So in terms of food and human health, poor quality diets are a leading global cause of death. For mental and social health, poor diets are also associated with low self-esteem, depression, and behavioral problems. Some of the most demanding and hazardous jobs exist in food systems, and collectively these effects make the urbanization food systems health links important for both research and policy interventions. In terms of the environment, food system agricultural activities contribute about 19 to 29% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions and have become a huge priority for global climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. Every year, the world generates approximately 1.3 billion tons of food waste, which is equivalent to 2.6 trillion US dollars. With a growing global population, these numbers are expected to rise unless there are drastic changes that address food waste and food systems. In terms of the economy, investing in local food systems creates increased self-reliance with less dependence on external food outputs to support local food security. So from 2010 to 2015, revenue from farms in the region of Waterloo grew by 19%, totaling $563.6 million in 2015, even though the cropland inventory in the region decreased by over 6,000 acres. So this helps to show there's a huge economic opportunity for growth if we preserve agricultural land in the region. So in the next slide, so we move on to large-scale food supply disruptions like COVID-19, which has highlighted some of the vulnerabilities of non-resilient food systems, such as health and economic inequalities for essential food workers. To use a local example of a vulnerable area was the temporary shutdown at Conestoga meat packers in the region due to a COVID-19 outbreak. So due to the nature of working conditions, among other things, in processing plants such as this one, there were various health and economic effects for people in the region. There are many approaches to developing and growing sustainable and resilient food systems globally and locally, such as the United Nations New Urban Agenda, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Milan Urban Food Policy Agenda as well. So the common food systems goals under these approaches frame cities as solutions rather than problems for modern world challenges that integrate nutritional and food security planning into urbanization strategies. So in the next slide, with food systems being so complex, there is no single solution, but rather choices, programs, and commitments tailored to local food system development that will help foster sustainable and resilient local food systems. As such, we are presenting the following 5 recommendations for the region of Waterloo. Our first recommendation is to continue focusing residential growth in urban areas. Urban expansion poses challenges for land use planning and protection of existing farmland. In the region of Waterloo official plan, protecting agricultural lands from urban development through a protected countryside designation is a policy that prevents urbanization on specific environmental features throughout the region. So focusing residential growth in urban areas of the region of Waterloo rather than greenfield developments will help to preserve land needed for agriculture for local food production. Our second recommendation is supporting peri-urban agricultural practices alongside nutritional literacy. So with the majority of the region's population expected to be living in urban areas by 2050, supporting urban agriculture through community gardens and vertical agriculture may be an important part of a local urban agricultural management strategy. Utilizing existing space for small-scale agriculture will also help to decrease food miles, carbon footprints, and could also free up some large-scale agricultural lands for future urbanization. One organization that the region of Waterloo may join alongside other municipalities in Ontario is the Ontario Food Collaborative, which aims to improve food literacy through policies and programs that support healthy food consumption. Our third recommendation is to apply the Human Appropriation of Land for Food Index, otherwise known as the HAF Index, for regional agricultural land use modifications. So the HAF Index is a way of measuring agricultural land that is required to feed the world population. It's expressed as global impacts of dietary patterns as a percentage of land needed. So what the region could consider doing is calculating a number of different population diet scenarios under the HAF Index to inform land use planning policies, ranging from current dietary patterns to dietary patterns that are less land intensive, but still nutritionally adequate. For example, in 2016, the majority, or about 69% of farms in the region of Waterloo were livestock farms, which is about 25% more than the provincial average. Since livestock farming is land and resource intensive, if the region of Waterloo applied the half index to calculate current land use versus shifting a percentage of the land away from livestock, we could compare the difference in how much agricultural land we would really need to sustain human nutrition in the region by 2050 under various dietary pattern outcomes. So in the last slide here, our fourth recommendation is to create effective food waste reduction programs and policies. So improving local public food policies will encourage health promotion, environmental sustainability, and economic resiliency. For example, adopting a policy and strategy to calculate food loss and food waste in the region will be important to quantify, understand, and also save excessive amounts of wasted edible food. Some other steps in the region of Waterloo that the region of Waterloo could take towards food waste resiliency includes building better infrastructure for cold storage solutions for food preservation, banning commercial food waste through policy formation and food recycling program implementations, and working with the region of Waterloo Food Bank to help distribute the edible food diverted from the landfill. So our fifth and final recommendation is to support local culture and economy through technological and digital innovation. The region of Waterloo has a high presence in employment in agriculture and technology. So with tech hubs such as Communitech, there's an opportunity to better utilize local startup culture for local agricultural advancements. Connecting local agriculture with food entrepreneurs is a really important step to solving modern food systems issues while growing the local economy. Supporting a resilient food system means continuously investing and innovating the food space across all levels, including distribution, production, and in food itself, through things like global agricultural innovations like online vegetable box subscriptions, vertical farming, and experimenting with lab-grown meat. With agricultural advancements like this on the rise across the world, there's a real opportunity to connect the region of Waterloo and the tech space here with the region's agricultural sector to enhance local economic activity. This concludes this presentation on resilient food systems in the region of Waterloo, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta. Our next presentation in the sequence is going to delve into air quality in the region. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thanks, Clarence. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Jeremy Pittman, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo School of Planning. I'm going to speak to you a little bit today about the environmental side of COVID-19 impacts in urban areas, as Clarence noted, with a focus on urban air quality, mostly because that's where most of the studies have been done so far. Next slide, please. Basically the approach I took was a rapid systematic review, which means that I was looking to synthesize across all the existing studies that are out there and try to draw some insights from them, and doing it quickly. That's kind of the rapid part, I guess, in order to inform this presentation. I started off with a really broad question that was around sort of, various environmental impacts from COVID. So, you all probably noticed right when the pandemic was kicking up or just beginning, there's a lot of news reports about, animals coming back to the city, the waterways in Venice running clear and all that kind of stuff. And what I was hoping to do with this presentation is to look at the peer-reviewed literature and see which of those potential consequences or beneficial consequences of the pandemic, which of those are we actually seeing in the peer-reviewed literature? So I did an initial literature search, and what I found was most of the studies so far had actually focused on urban air quality in the peer-reviewed literature. So that's where I sort of refined my research question, focus a little bit more on that. In terms of the wildlife and things like that, those types of studies take a little bit longer to do. So that's maybe why they're not showing up right now in the peer-reviewed literature, whereas air quality studies can be done with existing satellite data or through existing monitoring networks. So that might be a little bit of a reason why I was only finding air quality studies. Next slide, please. That just gives you a sense of the oh, if you could mind going back quick, sorry about that. That just gives you a sense of the keywords that I used to look for different papers in the different databases I mentioned before, but I did include keywords originally around wildlife and biodiversity, but they didn't have any hits. I used a research database called Scopus. Originally, I had 98 papers that came out, but after screening, there's only about 51 papers that are relevant. So the rest of the presentation that I'll be speaking to you about is about those 51 papers. Next slide, please. So this map just gives you a sense of where the different studies have been coming from so far. So you notice, 16 in China, 11 in India. Those are the places where there's been sort of the most research attention to date on the impacts of COVID on urban air quality. In some cases, in China in particular, there's actually even been multiple studies on the same city already. So that's kind of interesting. It's getting a lot of focus in those areas, or in those two countries. You notice, the numbers of studies aren't quite as high in the other countries. Brazil has 4, the US has about 3, and then there's a handful just from Italy, Spain, Morocco, and Malaysia, and as well as 1 in Kazakhstan. So, the bulk of the studies to date have been from China and India. There's a few more from Brazil and the US, and then just a handful from other countries throughout the world. One thing that's really important to note, however, is that so far as far as I could find, there hasn't been a study published on Canada yet. So that's kind of a research gap that remains, and probably should be some of focus for future research. Next slide, please. So what is sort of coming up in the sorry, my animations are kind of going all at once, but what's coming up as sort of the dominant narrative across these papers? So you have the lockdown that occurred. That's where we have these restrictions on travel, requirements to social distance, and that type of thing. What we're seeing across a lot of the studies, across a lot of the cities, is that actually reduced PM 2.5. So that's what we call a fine particulate matter. So pieces of dust and stuff like that in the air, as well as nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides, which are largely associated with the burning of fossil fuels or driving your car, essentially. So, and this makes a lot of sense. Due to the lockdown, we were seeing reduction in these different pollutants. And this range is kind of coarse, and I'm going to continue to refine a little bit as I dig it deeper into the studies. But anywhere from about 25% to 60% decrease in these different pollutants across the different cities that have been studied so far. One kind of interesting unintended consequence, though, that people are still trying to figure out exactly why it happened. There's a couple hypotheses, but essentially this reduction in fine particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur oxides potentially led to an increase in ground level ozone, or ozone that's kind of near the surface. And in some cases, that's a fairly significant increase, almost up to 116%. That's problematic for a number of reasons. Ozone, you think about the ozone at the top of the atmosphere, it's beneficial, right? It's something that we want there. But when it's kind of at surface level, it can cause breathing problems and stuff like that. And can be quite problematic for people that have existing conditions in terms of their respiratory system. So it's an interesting and potentially problematic interaction effect there. As we're dealing with a virus that impacts our respiratory system, there's also potentially more ozone in some of these areas, which also has a negative impact on our respiratory system. So some potential negative unintended consequences there. One of the mechanisms that's been proposed as to why that increase in ozone is occurring is basically because ozone reacts with nitrogen oxides in the local atmosphere in cities, and it reacts in a way that it removes the ozone. So as we're driving less and producing less nitrogen oxide, we're actually not there's less nitrogen oxide available for those reactions to take place, and thus we've had increased ozone in different places. So that's kind of one problematic feature to think about a little bit more. How do we kind of manage these secondary pollutants? The other thing that's not very well captured in a lot of the studies is the influence on weather, and you'll notice it there. Some studies have taken it into account, but a few studies haven't really addressed well whether or not the reductions we're seeing are actually due to weather or whether or not they're due to lockdowns. That's kind of another thing to think about. And finally, one final point for this slide is that The same thing doesn't seem to be happening everywhere. So there's some conflicting evidence from the US, actually conflicting papers, New York City in particular, where some papers suggest that there was a reduction, but others say that there wasn't. So this kind of needs to be dug into a little bit further. Next slide, please. So just to go through these kind of final thoughts quickly, I think I'm approaching my time, but just to kind of reiterate it, there is some evidence that air quality improved, but these changes might not be observed everywhere. And in particular, there's no Canadian studies currently, so that's something to kind of think about a little bit. That idea of secondary pollutants like ozone increase in many cases. So that's maybe a negative consequence of some of these things that needs to be thought through a little bit more. How can we actually manage these systems more holistically to address sort of multiple pollutants at the same time? And the final thought there, which is from probably one of the better studies that's out there by He et al. 2020, was just the idea that that study focused on China, and essentially what they were finding is that the air quality improvements that were associated with the lockdown, China was able to achieve similar improvements just from the different policies and regulations they implemented for the Beijing Olympics, and different fuel regulations and things like that they've already implemented. So it's just kind of a note, I guess, that even though the lockdown seems pretty drastic and it's this huge change in human activity that we expect to have like really great really huge impacts on the environment in a positive way, essentially it's a bit of a bright note in that through effective regulation and other policies, we can actually achieve similar types of reductions in pollutants in this case. So it's maybe one thing to think through a little bit as we develop policy to address these issues as well. Thanks, and I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you very much, Jeremy. We're now into the Q&A section for this particular group, and I've got a question for Lindsay and her team when it comes to, I guess, the public space, public realm that you examined. Oh, this is a pretty technical question related to widths of sidewalks and how that relates to trying to maintain a proper recommended distance. Did any of your work look at whether or not people were exploring changing things like the sort of the mandated guidelines for sidewalk width, which I think is currently less than 2 meters?
So currently a lot of the research being done is just showing that there's just simply not enough room. There's no real solutions as to how to mitigate this moving forward other than the expansion of the sidewalks onto streets, reducing the parking on streets and utilizing that as like what Montreal is doing as health corridors and super blocks. So reducing the speed limit, reducing the number of lanes on roads, and adding that extra space for, a lane for walkers and running, and then a lane for cyclists as well, along with the sidewalk. So that can also accommodate those long lines at local stores and all that kind of jazz. I don't know if Jennifer or Troy have an additional comments to this at all.
I have some additional thoughts. I think one of the light spots early in the pandemic was the gentleman walking down the city of Toronto with the hula hoop wrapped around him to demonstrate the 2 meter distance that would be required, and how impossible it was with light posts and newspaper boxes on the sidewalks. And so I think that COVID-19 has brought to light an issue that accessibility advocates have been talking about for a really long time. So the width of the sideways are inadequate for 2 individuals in a wheelchair or with other assisted mobility devices to get through. But because now it's impacting a larger population, it's now garnered some additional attention. So in the paper, one of the pieces that we look at is drawing on some of the accessibility, sort of accessibility rights components and bringing that into public space.
Right, thank you. And another question related to public realm, and we touched on it in a previous section as well, looking at active transportation, for example, is programming for winter, right? So, in your group's exploration, what are your thoughts around how the region can sort of work that in as well?
I'm happy to start. So there are other communities and cities in the world that have winter and that do this very successfully. Some of the gold standards in active transportation have winter and they're able to do this. So the region has made, certainly taken some steps in terms of plowing and taking care of their cycling lanes that they've just put in for the 5-year pilot. In particular, I'm thinking along the university corridor by our home base. And so, I mean, we know those best practices. We know how to do a lot of that work. Certainly ice is another issue that we face, and balancing those needs with some of the environmental impacts is certainly consideration. It's one of those, as Lindsay articulated, one of those wicked problems. We have a great solution for active transportation, but in the environmental realm, we're causing additional problems. So there's a lot of, certainly we make recommendations from the public space, human well-being, and dabbling on planetary health as well. But like most of these decisions, there's a lot of stakeholders that are going to need to be at the table to balance that off with some of the environmental preservation aspects that they're looking at.
All right, thank you. Just a question related to food and Marta's presentation. You touched on some of the examples of some of the changes that COVID was, I guess, seen realized in the food production system. And you talked about online delivery of food boxes. Could you expand on that a little bit further? I mean, I know it's something that I've heard a lot of people talking about, but I'm just curious how it fits in sort of short-term, long-term as a strategy for our food system.
Absolutely. Thanks, Clarence. Yeah, for the online subscription boxes and even, through places like Amazon, we've noticed upticks in people purchasing things online because either they don't want to go to stores because they want to limit their exposure to COVID-19, or they want to limit their exposure that they bring home to their families, et cetera. And one of the things that people had created pre-COVID-19 are food subscription boxes, but I think now is where we really started to see that take off a little bit. So people are becoming more comfortable with getting that delivered to their doors and are more happy to pay the fees for that. But currently the infrastructure, even we saw with Amazon deliveries and deliveries for stores all around, that really got extended. So before, if Amazon had 2-day prime delivery, that got extended to a longer period of time. And something like that doesn't really work for food, especially when you're ordering fresh boxes of food. And so that's going to be a really big challenge for regions and globally as well, for people to solve those issues in order to get that food delivered to consumers in a timely fashion in order to have those nutritious have that food stay nutritious and not be rotten by the time that it reaches the consumer.
I mean, do you think that there's enough pressure, not pressure, but enough demand mounting now that you could actually shift production to be, more localized rather than, again, I've got a friend that's got 500 acres. Well, that's a big operation in the Southern Ontario context for market gardening. But what about trying to within the region, for example, transition to smaller sort of farm operations? Absolutely.
I think people are starting to see more of the benefit of that. And even with, locally we have the Jacobs Farmers Market and the Kitchener Market downtown as well. I think people are looking more to those resources and those local availabilities of food, especially when, we see things that aren't on the shelves, the things that have had to travel long distances or cross borders, they're not in stock. And so we're really having to rely on, whether we know it or not as well, during a time like this, that the things on our shelves are have been more local than not. And so I think maybe whether if people know it or not, they are doing that, but I think they are starting to become more open to purchasing local because they're understanding the impacts that it has on, economy, environment, and everything else that's been kind of highlighted with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. Jeremy, the question, I think you can see it as well, related to the construction and activity related to roads, and whether or not, again, the lockdown created huge changes in terms of transportation activity, and hence you see that, I guess, little sort of mini boom of research related to air quality issues related, I think, to traffic as well, and heavy industry, et cetera. Did you come across any work that dealt with this whole sort of construction aspect of road system as well?
Not yet, but I imagine those studies are probably underway. It would make sense, but none look specifically at construction. There were a few from Brazil that looked at industrialized areas a little bit more so. But for the most part, a lot of the studies so far are mostly looking at, changes in just regular everyday driving your car to work kind of thing. But I imagine, what the implications are for construction industry and that type of thing are probably coming down the pike.
Yeah, and while I've got you, I mean, I'm just curious at the literature that you looked at.
Yeah.
Those papers, I mean, did they touch on to, sort of the pre-COVID emphasis, in the climate crisis? And, if we think of where we were at, like, 8-9 months ago,
Yeah.
that conversation's kind of got parked a little bit. But I mean, yet the first thing that people are looking at from an environmental standpoint is this air quality related to, traffic activity. So I'm just curious how that manifests itself in the literature that you looked at.
Yeah, and there's a question on the chat too, just about like what it means for CO2 levels and tying to climate change and that type of thing. So what the studies have shown so far is like in localized within cities that there are sort of reductions in CO2 that they're observing. But what that means for the global level and the long term, a lot of these studies so far as well, they're looking at the short term impacts. Will these kind of persist? That's been kind of a common theme in a lot of the presentations. Will these changes persist is a big question. But more so too, like, all these changes that happen, what's sort of the net impact on the global carbon budget? Nobody really knows yet. Some of those studies, like I imagine there's global carbon budget projects and things like that. They'll probably have data out on this like next year. We'll have a better sense of what this actually means long-term for climate change. But at least in the short term, and, at least localized in cities, there were sort of reductions in CO2 that related to, reductions in private transportation and air flights and that type of thing. But, does that have a lasting impact on the climate crisis? Jury's still out on whether or not it'll actually influence that at all. So, or make it worse even, right? You never really know.
It could.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so just conscious of the time as well, I wanted to thank the three groups for their efforts in this final session. And then I guess I'm now going to turn, I've been paying attention to see if he's actually still here, but I hope that Rod is still here because he was going to get asked to offer concluding remarks and kind of wrap up the day for us. On my behalf, I just wanted to thank all the presenters today for doing such a fantastic job. And for the audience for funneling in those questions. So Rod, without further ado, I'll hand it off to you to wrap this up.
Thank you very much, Clarence. This has been really quite an afternoon, and I'm actually kind of astonished by the scope of the work that's been presented to us here today. I would, and the other thing that has really kind of floored me is the geography of the people who are attending the seminar this afternoon. We had about 100 people from the Waterloo region, and then we had people from, and of course representing, the cities of Cambridge, Waterloo, a couple of townships. But the city of Guelph, the city of Ottawa, York Region, Owen Sound, Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority, the GRCA, the city of Toronto, Durham Region, Peel, Halton, Brampton, Hamilton, Markham, University of Alberta. So I think clearly there's the topic has resonated with a lot of people. This is this agenda has been focused on a very compelling set of questions. It's an important set of questions, not only for the region of Waterloo, but for local governance really across Ontario. And and beyond. There isn't a community in the world right now that's not going to face these types of questions in the months and years to come, because of the scale of COVID-19 and its impact on humanity. I'm really, I'm taken by the responsiveness of the University of Waterloo community to dig in on some of these questions. And I think the analysis is insightful and extremely helpful in bringing our debate forward. There isn't any doubt in my mind that it'll inform not only the public conversation that we're having in the region of Waterloo about the future of our region and the policy framework that we need to guide it, but also the very specific ways that we can actually build a better community. All the way from the nature of the economy that we live, that supports us, to the way that we dispose of waste, to the way that we design our public realm, and the nature of our agricultural economy. I know that from the point of view of our organization, it's been extremely helpful. I'm really excited about receiving the papers and taking a look at the way these arguments come together, the way this analysis comes together in the papers themselves. I think it's an important body of work. I had an email this morning from our new Chief Administrative Officer, Bruce Lochner, who said, "Listen, I need to see I'd like to get a copy of these papers when they're available. So please send them over to me." I know that we've got people from various departments on the line absorbing what's been presented. So, this is impactful work. These are important questions, and I really appreciate the effort that's been put into them by faculty members and students alike. So thank you very much for all of that.
All right, thanks, Rod. I'm not sure if I'm the one that should officially end the event at 3:58, but I guess that job does fall to me. So once again, our sincere thanks to everyone for hanging in there today, for contributing as you did on all fronts. And again, I really encourage you to follow up if you wanted. I know there's some questions that were asked that maybe didn't get a chance to be addressed. Someone was also asked about contacting the researchers. By all means, if you go to the University of Waterloo website, you'll be able to find contact information for those researchers, and encourage you to follow up with them. So thanks so much, everyone. Stay tuned to the region's website, where updates will be provided on this as well. And we will certainly catch you next time. So thanks, and stay safe.